The Wyoming Territory in October 1883 was a land of raw edges, where the sky stretched wide and unyielding, its blue pierced only by the jagged teeth of pine-covered hills. In a clearing carved from the wilderness, where frost clung to the grass like a whispered warning, Abigail Harper stood alone. Her breath steamed in the chill morning air, each exhale a fleeting ghost against the vast silence. She was 32, though the lines etched around her eyes spoke of years heavier than her age. Her hands, calloused and steady, gripped a hammer, its weight a familiar anchor. Before her, the skeleton of a cabin, rose logs stacked with painstaking precision, each one a testament to her refusal to break. She drove a nail into a crossbeam, the sharp crack of iron against wood splitting the stillness. This was her defiance, her sanctuary, built one log at a time in a world that had tried to bury her. Abigail's dark hair, streaked with early gray, was pulled back in a practical braid, though loose strands clung to her sweat-dampened forehead. Her wool dress, patched at the elbows, hung loose over a frame, made lean by labor and loss. She paused, wiping her brow with the back of her hand, and surveyed her work. The cabin was modest, 4 walls, a partial roof frame, and a dirt floor packed hard by her boots. It was hers, paid for with the last of her savings, a deed signed in a dusty office in Redstone, 30 miles east. No one had helped her drag the logs from the forest, nor had she asked. She had learned long ago that reliance was a luxury she could not afford. The clearing was encircled by towering pines, their branches heavy with the scent of sap and the promise of snow. Beyond them, the land rolled into hills that seemed to guard their secrets as fiercely as Abigail guarded hers. She had chosen this place for its isolation, a refuge from the whispers of Boston, where her name had become synonymous with shame. A husband who betrayed her, a child lost to fever, a family that turned away. She carried these like stones in her chest, each one sharpening her resolve. Here, in this untamed corner of the world, she could be no one but herself, answerable only to the rhythm of her hammer and the land that demanded her strength. Unseen, from the shadowed edge of the tree line, Lucas Granger watched. He sat astride a chestnut mare, his broad shoulders hunched slightly against the morning chill. At 35, Lucas was a man shaped by the land, his hands rough from mending fences, his eyes the color of dusk, carrying a quiet sorrow that rarely reached his voice. His coat, worn but clean, bore the dust of a long ride from his family's ranch, the Double Bar, 10 miles north. He had been checking boundary lines, a task that suited his need for solitude, when he stumbled upon the clearing. The sight of Abigail, alone and unyielding, had stopped him cold. Lucas was no stranger to loss. 5 years ago, a prairie fire had swept through his world, taking his wife, Eliza, and the life they had dreamed of building. He had buried her beneath a cottonwood tree, her laughter silenced forever. Since then, he had kept to himself, his days filled with work, and his nights with the ache of a home too empty. The townsfolk of Redstone respected him, the son of a prosperous rancher, but they did not know the man who rode alone, searching for a reason to believe again. Now, watching Abigail, he felt something stir, a yearning he thought had died with Eliza, a pull toward the woman who seemed to carry the weight of the world and refused to bend. Abigail, unaware of his gaze, lifted another log, her movements deliberate despite the ache in her shoulders. The wood was heavy, its bark rough against her palms, but she braced it against the wall frame with a grunt. She had no time for weakness. Winter was coming, and the cabin needed walls, a roof, a chimney that could draw smoke. Her food store, sacks of flour, dried beans, and a few jars of preserves were buried in a root cellar she had dug herself. She had planned for survival, not for company, and certainly not for the man whose presence she had yet to notice. Lucas shifted in his saddle, the mare snorting softly as if sensing his indecision. He knew he should ride on, leave her to her work. This was not his place, not his story. Yet something held him, the way her hands moved with purpose, the way her jaw tightened against the cold, the way she stood alone and made the wilderness yield. It was not pity, though he knew others might call it that. It was recognition, a quiet awe for a strength that mirrored the land itself. He nudged the mare forward, just enough to break the cover of the trees, his boots crunching on frost as he dismounted. "Ma'am," he called, his voice low, carrying the cadence of a man accustomed to speaking to horses and open skies. "Didn't mean to startle you, but I thought this land was unclaimed." Abigail froze, her hammer poised mid-swing. Her heart kicked against her ribs, a reflex born of too many betrayals. She turned slowly, her eyes narrowing as they settled on the man standing just beyond the clearing. He was tall, his frame solid but not imposing, his hat tipped slightly in a gesture of respect. The mare pawed at the ground, its breath clouding in the air. Abigail's grip tightened on the hammer, not as a weapon but as a reminder of her own strength. "This land is mine," she said, her voice sharp but steady. "Deeds filed, stakes driven. If you're lost, Redstone's east. If you're looking for trouble, you won't find it here." Lucas raised a hand, palm open, his expression calm. "No trouble, ma'am. I'm Lucas Granger, Double Bar Ranch, north of here. Was riding the boundary line when I saw your cabin. Didn't expect to find anyone building alone." Her gaze didn't soften. "I prefer it that way." He nodded, as if her words were answer enough. His eyes flicked to the cabinet's rough logs, the gaps where wind would slip through, the pile of timber waiting to be shaped. Then they settled on her hands, the gloves worn thin at the knuckles, the faint tremble of exhaustion she couldn't hide. "It's fine work," he said simply. "Takes grit to do this on your own." Abigail felt a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or unease at being seen. She turned back to the log, lifting it into place with a force that belied her fatigue. "Grit's all I've got," she said, driving a nail with a single, sure strike. "And I don't need anyone telling me what I already know." Lucas watched her a moment longer, his silence heavier than words. He saw the pride in her posture, the defiance in her movements, but also the weight she carried, hidden behind the set of her shoulders. He wanted to say more, to offer help, but he knew better. She was not a woman who welcomed charity, and he was not a man who offered it lightly. Instead, he tipped his hat again, a small gesture that felt like a promise he didn't yet understand. "If you ever need a hand," he said, mounting the mare, "Double Bar ain't far." Abigail didn't respond. She hammered another nail, the sound sharp against the quiet. Only when the hoofbeats faded into the trees did she pause, leaning against the cabin wall, her breath catching in her throat. The clearing felt emptier now, the silence louder. She pressed a hand to her chest, where the stones of her past seemed to shift, just slightly. She didn't know why his words lingered, why his respect unsettled her more than pity ever could. But as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the frost, she felt the first crack in the walls she had built around her heart. The wilderness watched, its pines whispering secrets to the wind. Abigail Harper was no longer entirely alone, though she would not admit it, not yet. And Lucas Granger, riding back to the Double Bar, carried with him the image of a woman who built not just a cabin, but a life, from the ashes of everything she had lost. The Wyoming Territory in early November 1883 wore a brittle chill, the kind that sank into bones and sharpened every sound. In Abigail Harper's clearing, the afternoon sun hung low, its light fractured by the skeletal branches of pines dusted with the season's first snow. The cabin stood taller now, its walls nearly complete, though gaps between the logs whispered of work yet undone. Abigail knelt beside a stack of timber, her breath clouding as she measured a plank with a carpenter's rule. Her hands, wrapped in gloves, fraying at the seams, moved with a precision born of necessity. The ache in her shoulders had become a constant companion, but she ignored it, just as she ignored the loneliness that clung to her like frost. She was building a life here, one nail at a time, and she would not falter. The clearing was silent save for the occasional snap of a twig under her boots or the distant call of a hawk circling above the hills. Abigail had grown accustomed to the quiet, finding solace in its predictability. It asked nothing of her, unlike the world she had left behind in Boston, where every glance carried judgment, every word a reminder of her failures. Here, the land was indifferent, and that indifference felt like freedom. She stood, brushing sawdust from her skirt, and lifted the plank to the cabin's frame. Her movements were steady, but her eyes flicked to the tree line, a reflex she couldn't shake. She had not forgotten the stranger from 2 weeks ago, the rancher with the steady voice and eyes that saw too much. Lucas Granger. His name lingered in her mind, an unwelcome guest. As if summoned by her thoughts, a soft crunch of frost broke the silence. Abigail's heart jolted, her hand tightening around the hammer. She turned, squinting against the sun's glare, and there he was, Lucas Granger, standing at the edge of the clearing. His chestnut mare pawed the ground, tethered loosely to a sapling. He wore a wool coat, its collar turned up against the wind, and his hat cast a shadow across his face. In his arms, he carried a small bundle wrapped in burlap. Abigail straightened, her posture a wall of defiance, though her pulse betrayed her calm. "Mr. Granger," she said, her voice clipped, edged with suspicion. "Didn't expect to see you back." Lucas stepped forward, his boots leaving shallow prints in the snow-dusted grass. "Didn't plan on it myself, ma'am," he said, his tone low and even, like a man soothing a skittish horse. "But I was riding this way, and I figured I'd check on your progress." His eyes moved to the cabin, taking in the new logs, the roof beams waiting to be raised. "You've done a lot in 2 weeks." Abigail's jaw tightened. She didn't need his approval, nor did she want it. "I manage," she said, turning back to the plank. She positioned it against the frame, her movements deliberate, as if his presence were no more than a passing breeze. But her hands trembled slightly, a flicker of unease she hoped he didn't see. She had spent years guarding herself against men like him, whose kindness came with expectations, whose words hid motives. Yet Lucas's gaze, steady and unintrusive, unsettled her in a way she couldn't name. He set the bundle on a nearby stump, keeping his distance. "Brought something," he said, nodding toward it. "Blankets. My mother made them. Said a new cabin needs warming, especially with winter coming." Abigail paused, her hammer poised mid-air. She glanced at the bundle, then at him, her eyes narrowing. "I don't take charity," she said, the words sharp enough to cut. "I've got what I need." Lucas didn't flinch. "Not charity," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Just neighborly. Out here, folks help each other. Doesn't mean you owe anyone." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to argue, to send him away with his blankets and his quiet insistence. But the wind picked up, slipping through the gaps in her coat, and she felt the truth of his words. Winter was no respecter of pride. She lowered the hammer, her shoulders sagging slightly, though her gaze remained guarded. "Why are you here, Mr. Granger? Really?" He looked at her then, truly looked, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. The hawk's cry faded, the wind softened, and it was just them two souls standing in a clearing that felt both vast and intimate. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice softer now, almost raw. "Saw you working that day, building this place alone. It stayed with me. Most folks would have quit by now. You didn't." Abigail's throat tightened. His words were simple, but they carried a weight. She hadn't expected a recognition of her strength, not her struggle. She turned away, busying herself with the plank, though her hands moved slower now. "I don't have a choice," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Quitting means going back, and I can't do that." Lucas nodded, as if he understood more than she'd said. He stepped closer, just enough to see the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the way her fingers curled tightly around the hammer. "You don't have to tell me why," he said, "but I know what it's like to keep going when everything's telling you to stop." She glanced at him, her defenses wavering. There was something in his tone, not pity, not judgment, but a quiet kinship. She saw it in his eyes too, a shadow of pain that mirrored her own. For a moment, she wondered what had carved those lines into his face, what loss had taught him to speak so carefully. But she pushed the thought away, unwilling to let curiosity soften her resolve. "I don't need company," she said, lifting the plank into place. Her voice was firm, but it lacked the bite of before. She drove a nail, the sound sharp against the frost. "I've got work to do." Lucas watched her, his expression unreadable. He wanted to say more, to tell her she didn't have to carry this alone, but he knew she wasn't ready to hear it. Instead, he stepped back, giving her the space she demanded. "Fair enough," he said. "I'll leave the blankets. Use them or don't. Your call." He turned to his mare, untying the reins with a practiced ease. Abigail watched him from the corner of her eye, her hammer still in hand. She wanted to call him back, to ask why he cared, why he saw her when she had spent so long trying to disappear. But the words stuck in her throat, tangled in years of distrust. She hammered another nail, harder this time, as if to drown out the questions in her mind. Lucas mounted the mare, his movements slow, deliberate. He tipped his hat, a gesture that felt less like farewell and more like a promise. "If you change your mind," he said, "you know where to find me." That. She didn't respond, didn't look up. The hoofbeats faded into the trees, leaving the clearing empty once more. Only then did Abigail lower the hammer, her breath catching in her chest. She walked to the stump, her fingers brushing the burlap bundle. The blankets inside were thick, woven with care, their warmth a stark contrast to the cold she had grown used to. She stood there, the snow falling softly around her, and felt something shift a crack in the armor she had worn for so long. The pines whispered as the sun dipped below the hills, casting the clearing in a soft, violet glow. Abigail carried the blankets inside, placing them in a corner of the cabin she had yet to furnish. She told herself it was practicality, not sentiment, but as she returned to her work, Lucas's words echoed in her mind. "Most folks would have quit by now. You didn't." For the first time in years, she felt seen not as a widow, not as a failure, but as a woman who refused to break, and though she would never admit it, not yet, that recognition warmed her more than any blanket could. The wilderness held its breath, waiting. Abigail Harper hammered on, her heart a little less alone, though she fought to deny it. And somewhere beyond the trees, Lucas Granger rode home, carrying the image of a woman who built not just a cabin, but a spark of something he thought he'd lost forever. In the Wyoming Territory, mid-November 1883, the air carried a bite that promised harsher days. Abigail Harper's clearing, nestled among pines now bare at their tips, was a study in resilience. The cabin stood prouder, its walls fully raised, though the roof remained a lattice of beams open to the sky. Snow dusted the ground, a thin veil that crunched under Abigail's boots as she hauled a bucket of water from the nearby creek. Her breath clouded in the gray dawn, her hands red and raw beneath her gloves. At 32, she had learned to measure time, not in days but in task logs stacked, nails driven, stores secured. Each was a step toward a life she could call her own, free from the ghosts of Boston that still haunted her dreams. Yet the solitude she had chosen was not without cost, and this morning it weighed heavier than the bucket in her hand. The clearing was quiet, save for the soft gurgle of the creek and the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush. Abigail set the bucket by the cabin's door, her eyes scanning the tree line out of habit. 2 weeks had passed since Lucas Granger's last visit, his blankets still folded in the corner of her cabin, untouched but not forgotten. She told herself she didn't need them, didn't need him, but his word simple, unadorned had taken root in her mind. Most folks would have quit by now, you didn't. They were a mirror held up to her strength, and she both resented and craved that reflection. She shook her head, pushing the thought away, and turned to the pile of shingles she had split yesterday. The roof needed finishing before the snow deepened, and she had no time for distractions. Inside the cabin, the air was cold, the dirt floor packed hard by her ceaseless pacing. A small table held her meager possessions: a tin cup, a worn Bible, a letter she had never sent to her sister back east. The walls, rough-hewn and unadorned, were a testament to her labor, but they could not shield her from memory. Boston had been a city of gaslights and promises, where she had married a man who swore to love her forever. His name was Thomas, and his betrayal had been as swift as it was cruel. Whispers of another woman, a home abandoned, a child lost to fever before she could even hold her. Abigail's family had closed their doors, their shame louder than their pity. She had fled west, carrying only her grief and a deed to this land. Here, she was building not just a cabin but a bulwark against that past. The sound of hoofbeats broke her reverie, faint at first, then unmistakable. Abigail's heart quickened, her hand reaching for the hammer tucked in her belt. She stepped outside, squinting into the morning mist that clung to the hills. Lucas Granger emerged from the trees, his chestnut mare moving with a steady gait. He wore a heavier coat now, its collar dusted with snow, and his hat sat low, shadowing his eye. In his arms, he carried another bundle, smaller this time, tied with twine. Abigail's shoulders tensed, her instinct to rebuff him warring with a curiosity she refused to name. "Morning, Miss Harper," Lucas called, reining in the mare. His voice was warm, like a fire banked low, and it stirred something in her she didn't trust. He dismounted, tying the horse to a post she had driven for her own cart. "Didn't mean to interrupt your work." "Then why are you here?" Abigail asked, her tone sharp but not unkind. She crossed her arms, the hammer still in hand, a shield against the vulnerability his presence provoked. "I told you last time, I don't need help." Lucas nodded, unfazed by her edge. He set the bundle on the same stump as before, his movements deliberate, as if giving her space to retreat. "Not help," he said. "Just something my mother sent. Tea, for the cold, and a jar of salve for your hands." He glanced at her gloves, the frayed seams betraying the toll of her labor. "She says a builder needs her hands strong." Abigail's eyes flicked to the bundle, then back to him. The gesture was small, practical, yet it pierced her defenses. She wanted to refuse, to send him away with his mother's gifts, but the ache in her palms was real, and the thought of tea warmth in a tin cup tempted her more than she cared to admit. "Your mother seems to think I'm her charity case," she said, her voice softer now, though still guarded. Lucas shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "She thinks you're stubborn as a mule and twice as tough. Says anyone building a cabin alone deserves a little kindness, whether they ask for it or not." Abigail's lips twitched, a reluctant spark of amusement breaking through her reserve. She set the hammer down, a small concession, and stepped closer to the stump. "You always do what your mother tells you?" she asked, her tone lighter, testing the waters. "Only when she's right," Lucas replied, his eyes meeting hers. There was no challenge in his gaze, only a quiet steadiness that made her feel seen not as a widow, not as a scandal, but as a woman who had chosen to stand. For a moment, the clearing seemed smaller, the distance between them less vast. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice low, as if the words were a confession she hadn't planned. "I wasn't always like this. Alone, I mean. Back east, I had a husband, a daughter." She swallowed, her throat tight. "He left when things got hard. She didn't make it through the winter." Lucas's expression shifted, a shadow passing over his face. He didn't speak at first, letting her words settle like snow on the ground. When he did, his voice was soft, heavy with understanding. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know what it's like to lose what matters most." Abigail looked at him, searching for the lie, the pity she had come to expect, but his eyes held only truth, a pain that mirrored her own. She wanted to ask, to know what had carved that sorrow into him, but the words felt too heavy, too intimate. Instead, she nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their shared wounds. "My wife Eliza," Lucas said, unprompted, his gaze drifting to the hills. "She died 5 years back. Prairie fire took our home, took her. I was out mending fences when it happened. Came back to ashes." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Haven't felt much like living since, just existing." Abigail's chest ached, a pang of recognition she hadn't expected. She saw the weight he carried, not in his words, but in the way his hands flexed, as if grasping for something long gone. "Why tell me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas met her gaze, his eyes clear despite the grief. "Because you're not the only one building something from nothing. Figured you should know that." Los. The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through her. For the first time in years, Abigail felt the urge to speak, to share more than she had intended, but fear of vulnerability, of trust clamped down hard. She turned to the bundle, untying the twine with hands that trembled slightly. Inside was a tin of tea leaves, fragrant with chamomile, and a small jar of salve that smelled of beeswax and herbs. Practical, thoughtful, and utterly disarming. "Thank you," she said, the words foreign on her tongue. She didn't look at him, afraid he'd see the crack in her armor. "For this, and for not pushing," Lucas nodded, stepping back to his mare. "I'll be on my way," he said. "But if you need anything, Miss Harper, you know where I am." She watched him ride off, the hoofbeats fading into the mist. The clearing felt emptier without him, though she would never admit it. She carried the tea and salve inside, setting them beside the blankets she still hadn't used. As she returned to her shingles, the weight of their conversation lingered, a warmth that battled the cold. Lucas Granger had seen her not just her work, but her wound sand. He had offered his own in return. It was a gift she didn't know how to accept, but as the snow began to fall, soft and relentless, Abigail felt the first stirrings of something she thought she'd buried. Connection. The pines stood sentinel, their branches bowing under the snow's weight. Abigail Harper worked on, her hammer's echo a quiet hymn to survival. And in the silence that followed, the memory of Lucas's voice lingered, a stranger's kindness that felt like the first step toward a home she hadn't dared to dream of. By mid-November 1883, the Wyoming Territory had settled into a restless hush, its hills cloaked in a thin layer of snow that muffled the world but not its judgments. In the town of Redstone, 30 miles east of Abigail Harper's clearing, the general store buzzed with more than the clink of coins and the rustle of sacks. Whispers curled through the air, carried by women in calico dresses and men with weathered hats, their voices low but sharp. They spoke of the woman in the wilderness, building a cabin alone, and of Lucas Granger, the Double Bar's heir, seen riding south too often, lingering where no respectable man should. Abigail felt the weight of those whispers now, though she stood far from town, her hands busy with a chisel as she shaped a roof beam in her clearing. The cabin was nearly whole, its walls sturdy, but the roof gaped open, a reminder of time running short before winter's full wrath. The morning was cold, the sky a flat gray that seemed to press down on the pines encircling her land. Abigail's breath steamed as she worked, her wool coat patched at the elbows, her braid tucked beneath a scarf. At 32, she had grown accustomed to labor's rhythm measure, cut, fit, repeat. But today, her movements were slower, her mind heavy with unease. She had ventured into Redstone yesterday, trading a basket of eggs for flour and thread. The store clerk, a wiry man named Hargrove, had been polite but distant, his smile tight, his eyes flicking to her hands as if searching for proof of the rumors. A woman behind her, Mrs. Tuttle, had murmured to another, "Building alone, they say, but Granger's been seen out there." Abigail had kept her head high, paid for her goods, and left, but the words clung to her like damp snow. Back in the clearing, she drove the chisel with a force born of frustration, the wood splintering under her hands. She had come to Wyoming to escape judgment, to build a life free from the scorn that had driven her from Boston. There, her husband's betrayal and her daughter's death had branded her a failure, a woman unworthy of pity. Here, she had thought the land would care only for her work, not her past. But Redstone's whispers proved otherwise, and Lucas Granger's visits, 3 now, each marked by small, thoughtful gifts, had woven her into a story she hadn't meant to write. She wanted to hate him for it, for drawing eyes to her solitude, but the memory of his steady gaze, his quiet respect, made anger feel like a betrayal of something she couldn't name. The cabin's interior was sparse but functional: a table, a cot, a crate for her few belongings. The blankets Lucas had brought still sat folded, joined now by a tin of tea and a jar of salve she had begun to use, though she told herself it was only practicality. She paused her work, rubbing her hands together, the salve's faint scent of beeswax, a reminder of his last visit. He had shared his Loshy's wife, Eliza. Taken by a fire, and she had shared hers, a confession that felt like peeling back a scar. The moment had left her raw, exposed, and yet strangely lighter, as if speaking her pain had loosened its grip. But now, with Redstone's gossip seeping into her thoughts, that lightness felt like a mistake, a door left open to a world eager to condemn. A new sound broke the clearing's quiet, not hoofbeats, but the creak of wheels and the jangle of harnesses. Abigail straightened, her chisel falling to her side as a carriage rolled into view, its black lacquer gleaming despite the dust of the trail. A driver, bundled in a heavy coat, sat at the reins, but it was the woman stepping down who drew Abigail's attention. Clara Vaughn was a vision of refinement, her coat trimmed with fur, her gloves pristine, her auburn hair pinned in an elegant twist. At 26, she carried the poise of a woman raised to command attention, her family's wealth a quiet power in Redstone. Abigail had heard of her, the intended bride of Lucas Granger, a match the town saw as inevitable. Clara's presence here, in this remote clearing, was a warning as clear as a storm cloud. "Miss Harper," Clara said, her voice crisp, cutting through the cold. She adjusted her gloves, her eyes sweeping over the cabin's rough walls, the scattered tools, the solitary woman before her. "I trust you know who I am." Abigail wiped her hands on her skirt, her posture stiffening. "I've heard the name," she said, her tone even but wary. "What brings you out here, Miss Vaughn?" Clara's smile was tight, polished but brittle, like glass ready to crack. "I'll be direct," she said, stepping closer, her boots leaving delicate prints in the snow. "Your association with Mr. Granger is causing talk. His visits, his time spent here's unbecoming, for him and for you. I'm asking you to end it." Abigail's heart thudded, but her face remained a mask. She had faced judgment before, her family's cold stares, Boston's whispered scandals, but this was different, personal, a woman staking a claim on a man Abigail had no right to want. "I haven't asked him to come," she said, her voice low, steady. "He chooses his own path." Clara's eyes narrowed, a flash of something, anger, perhaps, or fear breaking through her composure. "And you let him stay," she said. "You accept his gifts, his time. Do you think Redstone doesn't notice? They see a woman alone, building a life no decent woman would choose, and a man risking his name to play savior." The words stung, sharp as a slap, but Abigail held her ground. "I'm no one's project," she said, her voice rising slightly, edged with defiance. "I've built this cabin with my own hands, split my own wood, carried my own water. I've asked nothing of Lucas Granger but the respect he's shown me. If that threatens you, that's your burden, not mine." Clara's smile vanished, her hands clenching at her sides. "You think I'm threatened?" she said, her voice dropping to a hiss. "I'm protecting what's mine. Lucas is a good man, but he's drawn to broken things, women like you, who wear their suffering like a badge. It's romantic until the town turns on him, until his father cuts him off, until he's left with nothing but your scandals." Abigail felt her nails dig into her palms, the pain grounding her against the urge to lash out. "You don't know me," she said, her voice trembling now, not with fear but with a fury she hadn't felt in years. "You don't know what I've lost, what I've carried to get here. I'm not stealing your future, Miss Vaughn. I'm building my own." Clara stepped closer, her eyes cold, unyielding. "Then build it somewhere else," she said. "Sell this land. Go west, go east, go anywhere but here, where your presence taints everything he's worked for. You're not invisible, Miss Harper. Every time he rides out here, Redstone sees, and they judge. Not just you, him." "Oko." The air between them crackled, the clearing suddenly too small for their words. Abigail wanted to shout, to tell Clara she had no claim on Lucas's choices, but doubt crept in, cold and insidious. Was she the cause of his trouble, the reason his name was whispered in parlors and saloons? She thought of his last visit, the way he had looked at her, not with pity, but with something warmer, steadier. The memory was a lifeline, but Clara's words twisted it into a chain. "I don't control him," Abigail said finally, her voice quieter, the fight draining from her. "And I don't want his ruin. But I won't run because you demand it. "This is my home." Clara studied her, her gaze sharp, assessing. "You're stubborn," she said, almost pityingly. "But stubbornness won't save you when the snow buries this place, and Redstone turns its back. Think about that, Miss Harper. Think about what you're costing him." "Oh." She turned, her skirts swishing as she climbed back into the carriage. The driver snapped the reins, and the wheels creaked away, leaving the clearing silent once more. Abigail stood frozen, her chisel forgotten, her heart pounding with a mix of anger and fear. She looked at the cabin, her hands work, and felt a wave of doubt. Had she been fooling herself, thinking she could outrun judgment? Was her presence here, her refusal to bend, pulling Lucas into a scandal he didn't deserve? The snow fell harder now, cloaking the pines in white. Abigail picked up the chisel, her hands shaking, and returned to the beam. Each strike was a defiance, a refusal to let Clara's words undo her. But as the light faded, the whispers of Redstone echoed in her mind, and she wondered if her strength, the very thing Lucas admired, was the blade that would cut him deepest. The clearing held its secrets, but Abigail Harper felt exposed, her heart caught between the home she was building and the man who saw her worth in a world that refused to. Late November 1883 in the Wyoming Territory was a season of reckoning, where the land turned harsh and unforgiving, testing the mettle of those who dared to claim it. Abigail Harper's clearing, once a place of defiant creation, now stood vulnerable beneath a sky heavy with the threat of a blizzard. The cabin, nearly complete, bore the marks of her relentless labor, logs fitted tight, a chimney that drew smoke cleanly, and a roof, half shingled against the cold. Snow had piled ankle-deep around the walls, and the pines encircling the clearing sagged under its weight, their branches whispering warnings of the storm to come. Abigail, at 32, worked with a fevered urgency, her hands blistered beneath her gloves as she hammered shingles into place. The confrontation with Clara Vaughn a week ago had left a bruise on her spirit, but she channeled her doubt into action, determined to prove her place in this wilderness. The air was sharp, biting at her cheeks as she climbed down from the roof, her breath a fleeting mist in the fading light. Her wool coat, threadbare at the cuffs, did little to ward off the chill, and her braid, tucked beneath a scarf, was damp with sweat and snow. She paused, leaning against the cabin wall, her eyes scanning the tree line. Clara's words, "sell this land, go anywhere but here," echoed in her mind, a poison that mingled with the memory of Lucas Granger's visits. He hadn't returned since that day he shared his loss. The fire that took his wife, Eliza, and Abigail told herself it was for the best. Redstone's gossip, Clara's ultimatum, had made it clear. Her presence was a shadow on his future. Yet the absence of his steady voice, his quiet respect, left a hollow she hadn't expected, a loneliness sharper than the wind. Inside the cabin, the air was warmer, though not by much. A small fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the dirt floor. Abigail's possessions were Fewa cot with a thin blanket, a table holding her Bible and the tea tin from Lucas's mother, a crate with her clothes and tools. The blankets he had brought remained folded, but the salve had become a nightly ritual, easing the pain in her hands. She lit a lantern, its glow soft against the rough walls, and began preparing supper: a pot of beans and a heel of cornbread. As she stirred the pot, her thoughts drifted to Lucas, to the way he had looked at her, not with pity but with a recognition that made her feel whole. She pushed the thought away, focusing on the fire, but the ache in her chest refused to fade. The wind howled, rattling the cabin's door, and Abigail felt the first stirrings of unease. She stepped outside, securing the shutters with rope, her boots sinking into the snow. The sky was a roiling gray, the light nearly gone, and the air carried a weight that spoke of a storm unlike any she had faced. She checked the root cellar, ensuring her stores were safe, then returned to the cabin, barring the door against the growing gale. The isolation she had once craved now felt like a trap. The wilderness no longer a refuge, but a force that could swallow her whole. She sat by the fire, her hands trembling, and whispered a prayer she hadn't spoken since Boston, for strength, for survival, for something she couldn't name. Miles away, Lucas Granger saddled his mare in the Double Bars barn, his jaw set with a resolve that drowned out reason. The storm had been building all day, its threat clear in the sky's leaden hue, but his thoughts were on Abigail. He hadn't seen her since their last meeting, when her confession of loss had mirrored his own, forging a bond he couldn't ignore. Clara's visit to the ranch yesterday, her sharp words about propriety, and his father's expectations, had pushed him to a breaking point. He had ridden to Redstone that morning, faced his father in the saloon, and declared his engagement to Clara over. "I won't live a lie," he had said, his voice steady despite the old man's fury. Now, as the storm gathered, instinct screamed that Abigail needed him, alone in that clearing with a half-finished roof and a heart as guarded as his own. The wind tore at Lucas as he rode south, snow stinging his face, visibility shrinking to a few feet. His coat was soaked, his hands numb around the reins, but he pressed on, driven by a certainty he couldn't explain. The mare stumbled, her hooves slipping on ice, and Lucas dismounted, leading her through drifts that reached his knees. The trail to the clearing was barely discernible, the pines looming like sentinels in the whiteout. He thought of Eliza, of the fire he couldn't outrun, and vowed he would not fail again. Abigail was out there, building a life from nothing, and he would not let her face this storm alone. Back at the cabin, Abigail paced, the wind's howl now a scream that shook the walls. She added logs to the fire, her movements frantic, as if motion could keep fear at bay. The storm was a living thing, clawing at the shingles, slipping through the gaps she hadn't yet sealed. She thought of Clara's warning, of Redstone's judgment, and wondered if this was her punishment for daring to stay. The blankets in the corner caught her eye, and for the first time she unfolded one, wrapping it around her shoulders. Its warmth was a small defiance, a refusal to let the stormer Clara win. She sat by the hearth, clutching the tea tin, and let herself remember Lucas's voice, his story of loss, the way he had seen her strength when she felt only fracture. A thud at the door startled her, faint but deliberate. Abigail froze, her heart pounding. The wind screamed, but the sound came again, knock, insistent, human. She grabbed the hammer, her only weapon, and approached the door, her breath shallow. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling but firm. "Lucas," came the reply, muffled by the storm but unmistakable. "Abigail, it's me." She unbarred the door, and Lucas stumbled inside, snow cascading from his coat, his face pale with cold. His hat was gone, his hair plastered to his forehead, and his hands shook as he closed the door against the gale. Steam rose from his shoulders in the firelight, and his eyes, dark with exhaustion, found hers. "You're all right," he said, his voice rough, as if the words were a prayer answered. "What are you doing here?" Abigail asked, her hammer still in hand, her voice caught between relief and disbelief. "You could have died in that storm." Lucas leaned against the wall, catching his breath. "Couldn't stay away," he said. "Not with this storm, not knowing you were out here alone." He straightened, his gaze steady despite the chill. "I told my father today. The engagement's off. Clara, the ranch, all of it. I'm done living for Redstone's expectations." "Oof." Abigail's breath caught, the hammer slipping from her fingers. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was a fool to risk everything, but the sincerity in his eyes stopped her. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why throw it all away?" He stepped closer, snow melting into puddles at his feet. "Because it's not throwing away," he said. "It's choosing. You, this place, the truth I see in you's more real than anything I've had in years. I'm not here to save you, Abigail. I'm here because you're worth standing beside." The words cracked something in her, a wall she had built to keep the world at bay. Fear surged, fear of trust, of love, of the pain that followed, but so did a warmth she hadn't felt since before Boston, before loss became her shadow. She gestured to the fire, her voice unsteady. "Sit. You're half frozen." They worked together in silence, Lucas helping her secure the shutters from inside. their movements a quiet dance of necessity. The storm raged on, but within the cabin, a fragile peace took hold. Abigail handed him a cup of tea, their fingers brushing, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Not of the storm, of this, of you." Lucas nodded, his eyes soft but unwavering. "I know," he said. "I'm scared too, but I'd rather face that fear than lose the chance to build something real with you." 1. The fire crackled, the storm howled, and Abigail felt the weight of her solitude shift, not gone but shared. Lucas Granger had braved a blizzard for her, not out of pity but out of a promise she was only beginning to believe. The cabin, her refuge, felt warmer now, not just from the fire but from the man who saw her as more than her scars. And as the snow buried the world outside, Abigail Harper dared to hope that this storm might mark not an end, but a beginning. Early December 1883 in the Wyoming Territory was a time of unrelenting cold, where the wilderness seemed to hold its breath beneath a quilt of snow. Abigail Harper's clearing, cradled by pines now heavy with ice, was a beacon of defiance against the elements. The cabin stood nearly complete, its roof shingled, its chimney puffing steady smoke into the gray dawn. Inside, the walls bore the scars of Abigail's labyrinths from her chisel, stains from her sweat butt. They also held her hope, a fragile thing nurtured by the man who had braved a blizzard to stand by her side. At 32, Abigail was no stranger to survival, but now, as she moved through the cabin, her hands resting on the swell of her belly, she faced a new challenge, the imminent birth of her child, a secret she had guarded even from Lucas Granger. The morning was still, the storm that had raged a week ago now a memory, though its snowdrifts lingered, sealing the clearing in silence. Abigail's breath clouded as she stoked the fire, her movements slow, deliberate, weighed by the child growing within her. Her wool dress, let out at the seams, stretched tight over her frame, and her braid, once neat, hung loose, strands clinging to her flushed cheeks. She had known she was pregnant since Boston, a truth she had buried beneath her flight west, believing the child's father her estranged husband. Tomasha had no claim to it. The baby was hers alone, a spark of life she would protect, just as she had protected herself by building this cabin from nothing. But the weight of her secret, coupled with Lucas's recent promise to stand by her, pressed against her heart, a mix of fear and longing she couldn't untangle. The cabin's interior was warmer now, the gaps in the walls sealed with clay and moss. A cot stood against one wall, draped with the blankets Lucas had brought, their wool a quiet comfort she no longer resisted. The table held her Bible, the tea tin, and a small cradle she had begun carving, its lines rough but tender. She paused, running her fingers over the wood, and felt the baby kick, a sharp reminder of time running out. The storm had delayed her preparations, but she had gathered what she could: clean cloths, a kettle for boiling water, herbs for pain. She had birthed her daughter in Boston, only to lose her to fever, and the memory of that loss was a shadow that never left. This time, she vowed, would be different, even if it meant facing the birth alone. Outside, the snow glittered under a weak sun, the pines standing like sentinels around the clearing. Abigail stepped onto the porch, her boots crunching, and scanned the horizon. Lucas had not returned since the night of the storm, when he had declared his choice to break with Clara and Redstone's expectations. His words, "I'm here because you're worth standing beside," had cracked her defenses, but they also terrified her. She hadn't told him about the baby, hadn't found the courage to reveal a truth that could change everything. What if he saw her not as strong but as burdened, a woman tied to a past she couldn't escape? The thought was a knife, cutting through the warmth his presence had kindled. She returned inside, her hands busy with tasks to keep fear at bay, sweeping the floor, mending a tear in her coat, boiling water for tea. The chamomile's faint scent filled the air, a reminder of Lucas's mother, of a kindness that felt like family. Abigail sat by the fire, sipping the tea, and let herself imagine him here, his steady hands helping her secure the cradle, his voice easing the silence. But imagination was a dangerous thing, and she pushed it away, focusing on the practical. The baby would come soon, perhaps today, and she had to be ready. She laid out the cloths, checked the kettle, and whispered a prayer, not for herself but for the child she would soon hold. The day wore on, the light fading to a pale gray as clouds gathered once more. Abigail's back ached, a dull throb that grew sharper with each hour. She paced the cabin, her hands gripping the table during moments of tightening pain, her breath hitching. The first contraction came like a wave, stealing her air, and she sank to the cot, her eyes wide with both dread and determination. She had faced storms, hauled logs, driven nails. This was another labor, one she would endure. She lit every lantern, their glow a small defiance against the gathering dark, and moved to the hearth, where the fire's warmth steadied her. The contractions grew closer, fiercer, and she bit back cries, her hands clutching the cradle's edge as if it could anchor her through the pain. Outside, the wind rose, a low moan that built into a howl, snow swirling in bursts against the cabin's walls. Abigail worked through the pain, boiling water, folding cloths, her body trembling but unyielding. She thought of her daughter, lost to fever, and vowed this child would live, would know a mother who fought for her. The labor intensified, each contraction a fire that tore through her, and she sank to the floor, her voice breaking in a raw scream. She was alone, miles from help, and the wilderness cared nothing for her struggle. Yet in that moment, she felt a fierce strength, a mother's resolve that burned brighter than fear. She pushed, her body breaking and rebuilding, until a cry high, piercing, alive filled the cabin. Abigail sobbed, her hands trembling as she lifted the baby, a girl, to her chest. The child's skin was damp, her fists tiny and fierce, her cry a song of survival. Abigail wrapped her in a clean cloth, kissing her forehead, whispering, "You're here, my Rose, you're here." The name came unbidden, a nod to the hope she had scarcely dared to feel. She rocked her daughter, tears falling, the firelight casting their shadows as one. The storm raged on, but within the cabin, a new warmth took hold, a mother's love that no wind could extinguish. Hours passed, the night deepening, and Abigail, exhausted but vigilant, tended to Rose, feeding her, cradling her against the cold. She had survived, they had survived, but the absence of Lucas gnawed at her. She had wanted to face this alone, to prove she needed no one. But now, with Rose in her arms, she felt the ache of his absence like a wound. The storm had sealed the trails, and she told herself he was safe at the double bar. Yet fear whispered that he might have tried to come, might be lost in the snow. A faint thud broke her thoughts, a sound not of wind but of purpose. Abigail's heart leaped, her arms tightening around Rose. She moved to the door, her body aching, and opened it to a blast of snow, and the sight of Lucas Granger, soaked and staggering, his coat crusted with ice. His face was pale, his breath shallow, but his eyes found hers, then Rose, and softened with a wonder that stole her breath. "Abigail," he said, his voice hoarse, stepping inside. He closed the door, snow falling from his shoulders, and sank to his knees by the fire, steam rising from his coat. "I tried to get here sooner. The storm. I thought I'd lost you." She stared at him, her throat tight, Rose stirring against her chest. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, but the words lacked conviction. "It's too dangerous." Lucas shook his head, his gaze locked on the baby. "Had to," he said. "Knew you were out here, alone. Didn't know about." He trailed off, his eyes flicking to Rose, then back to Abigail, a question unspoken. "Her name's Rose," Abigail said, her voice trembling. "She's mine. From before. I didn't tell you. I couldn't." He nodded, no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet reverence. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice breaking, "like her mother." Abigail's eyes burned, the weight of her secret lifting, replaced by a warmth she hadn't known she could feel. She shifted Rose into his arms, a gesture of trust that felt like a vow. Lucas held the baby gently, his calloused hands steady, and looked at Abigail with a promise that needed no words. "Mind if I stay?" he asked, his voice soft, raw. "Only if you're sure," she replied, her heart opening despite her fear. The storm howled, but the cabin was a haven, its walls holding not just Abigail and Rose, but Lucas, too. They had survived the night, and in Rose's cry, Abigail heard the birth of something new, not just a child, but a family, fragile and fierce, built from the ashes of their pasts. Spring 1884 in the Wyoming Territory was a season of quiet rebirth, where the land shed its icy armor and whispered promises of renewal. Abigail Harper's clearing, once a battleground against winter's wrath, now bloomed with the tentative green of wild grasses and the soft hum of life returning. The cabin stood complete, its logs weathered but proud, its roof slanted to shed rain, its chimney trailing a lazy curl of smoke into the morning sky. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of pine and bread, and the sound of a baby's coo mingled with the steady rhythm of hammer and saw outside. Abigail, at 32, stood on the porch, her daughter Rose cradled in a linen sling against her chest. The weight of the past Boston's betrayals, Redstone's judgment still lingered, but here, in this hard-won home, she felt the stirrings of peace, rooted in the man who had chosen to stay. The clearing was alive with spring's touch. Snowmelt fed the creek, its babble a counterpoint to the birdsong weaving through the pines. Wildflowers lupine and columbina dotted the edges of the clearing, their colors a soft defiance against the gray of winter's memory. Abigail's wool dress, patched but clean, hung looser now, her frame still lean from months of labor and the demands of motherhood. Her braid, streaked with gray, was pinned neatly, and her hands, though scarred, moved with a new ease, the salve from Lucas's mother, a ritual that had become a comfort. Rose, 3 months old, gurgled softly, her tiny fists grasping at the air, her eyes the same fierce blue as her mother's. Abigail kissed her forehead, her heart swelling with a love that felt both fragile and unbreakable. Outside, Lucas Granger knelt near the cabin, driving a post into the thawing earth for a new kitchen annex. At 35, he was a man remade by choice, his broad shoulders dusted with sawdust, his dusk-colored eyes bright with purpose. His coat lay folded on a stump, his shirt sleeves rolled to reveal arms corded from ranch work, and now this building a future with Abigail. The double bar, his family's ranch, was a distant obligation now, his father's threats to disown him a price he had paid willingly. Redstone's gossip had softened, worn down by the quiet truth of his and Abigail's resilience. He glanced up, catching Abigail's eye, and grinned, a warmth in his expression that made her breath catch. "Soil's soft today," he called, wiping his brow. "Good for building." Abigail smiled, stepping off the porch, Rose bouncing gently in the sling. "Or maybe it knows we've got plans," she replied, her voice light, but carrying a depth that spoke of their shared journey. She moved to his side, inspecting the post, her fingers brushing the wood. The act of building, once her solitary defiance, had become a partnership, each nail and beam a testament to the life they were crafting together. Lucas had been here nearly every day since Rose's birth, his presence as steady as the pines, his love a quiet force that had eroded her fear of trust. The cabin's interior reflected their new reality. The cot had been replaced by a proper bed, its frame carved by Lucas, draped with quilts from his mother. The cradle stood by the hearth, Rose's safe haven, its wood polished by Abigail's hands. The table held not just her Bible and tea tin but a small vase of wildflowers, a touch of beauty she had once thought frivolous. A letter, sealed and ready for the post, lay beside either formal request to a Boston law office to dissolve her marriage to Thomas. The decision had been months in the making, each word a step toward freedom, not just from her past, but from the shame that had bound her. She had written it last night, her hand trembling but sure, Lucas sitting across from her, his silence a steady support. The morning unfolded with a rhythm they had come to cherish. Lucas worked on the annex, his hammer's echo, a counterpoint to Abigail's tasks churning butter, mending Rose's tiny clothes, tending the fire. They spoke little, their connection deeper than words. But when they did, it was with an ease that felt like home. Abigail paused to bring him water, Rose dozing against her chest, and Lucas took the cup, his fingers brushing hers. "You're getting good at this," he teased, nodding at the churn. "Might put the Double Bar's dairy out of business." "Lit." She laughed, a sound that still surprised her with its lightness. "Keep dreaming, Granger," she said, but her eyes held his, a warmth passing between them that needed no name. Moments like these, small and ordinary, were the roots of their love, planted in the thawing earth of spring. Yet beneath the ease lay a truth: they both felt the world beyond the clearing, Redstone's watchful eyes, the legal ties that still bound Abigail to her past. They had faced storms together, but the future held its own challenges, and they would meet them as they had everything else, side by side. By noon, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the clearing. Abigail sat at the table, feeding Rose, while Lucas joined her, his hands dusty but gentle as he stroked the baby's cheek. "She's growing fast," he said, his voice soft, tinged with wonder. "Looks more like you every day." "That—" Abigail's throat tightened, not with fear but with gratitude. "She's got your stubbornness," she said, her tone teasing but her eyes serious. "Won't sleep unless she's had her way." Lucas chuckled, but his gaze turned thoughtful. "You did it, you know," he said, his voice low. "This place, Rose, all of it. I thought I was coming here to help, but you've built something I didn't know I needed. Love." Abigail looked at him, truly looked, and saw not just the man who had braved a blizzard, but the one who had stayed, who had chosen her and Rose over Redstone's expectations. "You helped more than you know," she said, her voice catching. "I was so afraid to let anyone in. You made it feel safe." The moment held them, the cabin a quiet witness to their truth. But the world outside beckoned, and that evening they welcomed visitors: the Larsons, a farming family from near Redstone, and old Mrs. Tuttle, whose gossip had once stung but who now brought a knitted shawl for Rose. Supper was simple stew and cornbread, but the table was full, laughter mingling with the clink of tin cups. Lucas stood, taking Abigail's hand, and spoke to their guests, his voice steady. "This woman," he said, his eyes on her, "is the strongest I've ever known. I came to help, but she's the one who saved me." Abigail's cheeks warmed, but she didn't look away. "No rings yet," she said, her voice soft but clear. "But we've got roots, and that's enough for now." The guests raised their cups, their smiles genuine, no longer shadowed by judgment. Out here, love was proven in shared labor, in the warmth of a cabin built from nothing, not in papers or promises made in a church. Later, as the guests departed and the sky turned lavender, Lucas finished the kitchen door, revealing a handle he had carved, a smooth, curved piece of oak, polished to a sheen. "Found it split in the woods," he said, his hand covering hers as she traced it. "Thought it was useless, but it just needed shaping. Like some folks." Abigail's eyes burned, her fingers lingering on the wood. "Like us," she said, and he nodded, his smile a promise of permanence. That night, she sat at her table, Rose asleep in the cradle, and wrote a letter on a scrap of her father's old stationery. "Dear Pa," she began, her hand steady, "you said a home was a feeling, not a place. I didn't believe you then, but now I do. I built this cabin, fought storms, carried Rose. But it was Lucas, with his heart like yours, who made it home. We're not alone anymore. Love, Abigail." She folded the letter, placing it in a tin box with her few treasures. Outside, Lucas mended a fence, his silhouette strong against the dusk. Abigail stepped onto the porch, Rose in her arms, and walked toward him, the wildflowers brushing her skirts. The wind carried the scent of pine and promise, and as she reached him, their eyes met, a silent vow that spring had only begun to bloom. The clearing, once a refuge from the world, was now a world of their own, its roots deep in the thawing earth, holding Abigail, Lucas, and Rose in a love that no season could undo. In the tender embrace of a Wyoming spring, Abigail Harper and Lucas Granger stood together, their cabin a testament to resilience and love. Rose, their beacon of hope, laughed in the cradle, her tiny voice weaving through the pines. They had faced storms, judgment, and the ghosts of their pasts, yet emerged not broken but whole. Their love, a fire kindled in the wilderness. Abigail's hands, once scarred by solitary labor, now held Lucas's, their calluses a shared map of survival. This was no fairy tale, it was love forged in sweat, tears, and the quiet choice to stay, to build, to believe in each other when the world turned away. The lesson here is simple yet profound. Love is not found in grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but in the courage to stand beside someone, to share their burdens, and to build a home from the ruins of loss. Abigail and Lucas teach us that true love is a verb active, enduring, rooted in the small, steady acts that defy despair. Their story lingers, a reminder that even in the wildest of places, hope can bloom, fierce and unyielding. If Abigail and Lucas's journey stirred your heart, if you felt the ache of their struggles and the warmth of their triumph, join us at Wild West Love Tales. Hit subscribe to dive into more stories of hearts that dare to love against the odds. Leave a comment with the number 8, a symbol of eternal love, a nod to the forever they built. Share your thoughts, and let's keep these tales alive, where love always finds its way.